I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Eric Teetsel.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right. Today, it's kind of a SCOTUS special because so many cases came down on this Monday morning. I will kick us off by talking about the duo of cases on federal removal powers, Slaughter and Cook. Then we'll kick it over to Ben to talk about the much bigger disappointment, which is the Election Day case. And then Eric will talk about adding the Bible to how the Texas has added the Bible to the school curriculum there. And finally, Inez will give us a sort of update on Iran. So since I have the floor and it's mine first, this morning had two very big SCOTUS cases, among others, but there's an interesting pairing. The most important case, I think, and even though I was disappointed by others, the most important case is Trump v. Slaughter, which concerned the president's authority to remove a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. And that the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that he could, and more importantly, they squarely overruled Humphrey's executor, which is a very famous case that sort of established the legitimacy of so-called independent federal agencies and allowed for there to be prevention of removal at will and demands for for-cause removal, even for agencies that were wielding some amount of executive power. That's no longer good law. Slaughter says that Humphrey's executor, to the whatever extent it was still good law already, which was not much, is overturned, and the president has the right to remove these people at all. This is one of those things that I actually found. I gave a speech at a 2022 NatCon all the way back 4 years ago now, where I talked about one of the primary pieces of not the primary, but a piece of the next Republican president's agenda should be to seek the repeal, the overturning rather, of Humphrey's executor, because it was bad law and it was hindering the ability of the president to actually control the bureaucracy and control the full executive branch. Well, now that's been done. President Trump did exactly what we wanted to. He purported to fire people that he did not have under previous law the obvious authority to fire. That led to litigation, and he has prevailed in that litigation. This is a very good thing. The FTC is, not just some body that advises broadly on law. It has its own independent enforcement authority. It can go out and sue people civilly and get massive judgments from them if they do it wrong. That kind of authority is just classic executive power, the ability to execute and enforce laws. And that's not just them. The FCC has a similar authority to bring civil lawsuits, or anyway, basically impose civil fines, at least, on communications organizations that are not obeying its regulations. The way our government is structured, it's the idea that it vests all executive power in the president of the United States. And finally, there were so many other decisions of the Supreme Court that recognized that meant that Humphrey executor was this weird outlier that had this unique and version of how it viewed executive power that was just totally out of step with how the modern Supreme Court looked at the thing. So its repeal was kind of inevitable, I think. But Trump, to his credit, decided to take it head on, have it, take the actions necessary to trigger litigation, and then have his DOJ pursue it to the full. And now we've won it. It's a big deal that basically Congress won't be able to create more of these independent agencies in the future. And this is also very important because this is the way in which sort of progressive priorities get baked into the government, even in the face of elections that are won by Republicans, is that you have these parts of the executive branch that just can't be meaningfully controlled by the president. That's over. President gets to control who's on the FTC. President gets to control who's on the FCC. They don't get to run their own agenda contrary to the agenda of the president. It's just not a thing anymore. And that's a very good thing for the country. It's a very good thing for conservative priorities, broadly speaking. The second case, which is sort of an interesting wrinkle on that, is Trump v. Cook, where in that case, they actually stayed the attempt, or essentially declined to stay an injunction that prevented President Trump from removing one of the board members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Lisa Cook. That case looks like it was decided on much narrower grounds because it doesn't seem to really jive with the logic of Slaughter as the idea of the Federal Reserve as an agency is independent. But my understanding, reading the opinion, is that the Supreme Court relied on the fact that the DOJ didn't really challenge whether or not the Fed was constitutional or whether having for-cause removal provisions was unconstitutional. Rather, they tried to make an argument that simply Trump had the right, given these mortgage fraud allegations against Cook, that he had the right to make a determination that she had, that there was a for-cause, that she had essentially done something that constituted cause, and therefore she was removed for it. I feel like the Supreme Court was kind of playing games here to try and keep some vestige of independence in the Federal Reserve for the moment. And I don't know how long this will really last. I mean, I think maybe the next president will try and really challenge the Fed head on, unlike this particular circumstance. Strikes me as a big legal realism move, where I think that there's sort of a view broadly among the Supreme Court, even the conservatives, that independent agencies are bad everywhere, but maybe the Fed is like the only exception where the president shouldn't have control over monetary policy. Maybe that's true. I don't know, but I don't think. I think it's kind of a weird it's a weird decision. It probably doesn't jive with the rule in Slaughter. I think in the end, it's a lot more important that Slaughter got decided the right way. It sets a rule for the future that ensures that Republicans will be able to control the government properly. But I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, this is probably the thing. I know that we're all waiting for the birthright citizenship case, but this is to me the most important decision for the right, um, maybe in my lifetime, honestly. I can claim to beat Will here because I've been writing about this since 2015. It is simply cannot be the case that we have an entire fourth branch of government that is not elected, that is not really overseen, but makes important policy decisions for the American people. Never have to stand for election. There's basically no way to actually push back when they create a decision that affects your life the way that government is supposed to be, for the people, by the people. Um, it is wildly unconstitutional. It's one of those things that the right was talking about in symposia for, whatever, decade after decade after decade, but nobody was doing anything substantive about until President Trump came along. I think Trump's first term really taught him a lesson about how you can come in. I always use this analogy, but Republicans have been saying that transition time for a new administration, they call it like landing. A new administration is landing, right? As though they're talking about Omaha Beach, because that's really how it is. And I got very sort of blackpilled on this issue when I was an intern, and I had the opportunity to listen to somebody very thoroughly establishment, Mitch McConnell's wife, Elaine Chao, but she had been the labor secretary under Bush. And she was explaining how basically it took her the entire 4 years to enforce something that was a 1970s law. The law was there in black and white, but because her own agency fought her every step of the way, whether that's by work slowdown, whether that's by saying it's impossible, whether it's by just simply like not doing what the political instructions from the president to his cabinet members down to these rank and file bureaucrats actually were, it took her 4 years to enforce a law that's been on the books since 1970. Okay, that is not a way to govern. It's been an institutional thorn in the right side. It means that even when we win elections, we have to select one or two priorities to get through the executive branch because everybody will work against you. And there's all these great surveys now showing that something like 2/3 or 3/4, depending on the survey, of unelected bureaucrats say that they would refuse an order that they thought was not correct from the Trump administration, even if they thought that order was lawful. Okay, that's not constitutional governance. That's not even small d democratic governance. That is ruled by bureaucrats. So this is a really important decision, I think, not just for the Trump administration, for every Republican administration going forward. It is great to see our actual constitutional design restored. We are not supposed to have like the executive branch without the control of the president. That's not how our system works. We're taking it one step towards, I think, the unitary executive. That is the constitutional design. And it's just even more important in an environment where Congress so rarely actually does its job and legislates, that at least the executive branch be under the control of the president and therefore responsive to the American people every 4 years in elections. So this is good for the right. This is good for the Constitution. And this is a big W in my book. This is a big W that overshadows what is likely to be, also Ben's segment about elections. All those things are important, but this is a structural issue that has been, not to mince words, screwing the right and screwing voters for decade after decade after decade. So this is big. This is a big one.
Huge win. Well, I foot stomp everything you all both said. I think Will was right when he said this is one of those most important pieces that a Republican president should try to go after. The Trump administration deserves immense credit for doing it, for knowing that this decision was going to result in litigation that they wanted because they thought they had a strong case. They thought they had the makeup of the court, and they did. And now you've seen a win that's going to pay dividends for generations, undoubtedly. It's a big deal. I also want to affirm what Inez said there at the end, that for those of us who've been frustrated by the inaction of Congress, coupled with the increasing power of this unelected, unconstitutional administrative state, as Congress has written these broad laws and just granted huge deference to unelected bureaucrats to make decisions, because of Humphrey's executor, there's been no check from the executive on that power until today. And now there finally can be. It's a huge fix, but the next half of that equation is still out there that we need to continue to work on, which is asking Congress to actually write laws.
And asking Congress to write laws also points to sort of the broader issue, which is that we're sitting here with bated breath waiting for the Supreme Court to tell us what passes muster and what doesn't. And as a consequence of that, of course, SCOTUS has usurped so much power from the executive and legislative branches and ultimately from we the people. And one of those unelected, unaccountable, apparent branches that was created in these rulings today was the Federal Reserve Board. So I will say that, of course, executing Humphrey's executor massively trumps what I think is a ludicrous ruling when it comes to the Federal Reserve. And it's sort of an interim ruling because it's not actually a final ruling about could the president fire Lisa Cook and did he do so in the proper method, et cetera. So let me say up front that I concur in all of your assessments. This is a massive win that essentially what the court says is the executive branch is the executive branch. These agencies fall under the executive. Otherwise, they'd be in a fourth branch of government that is not to be found in the Constitution, obviously, and that they must be subjected to the political control of the people via the executive, and they are subordinate to him. That's obviously massively important. Personnel is policy, and the personnel are, of course, responsive ultimately to our elected leaders, including the president. So that aside, that massively positive ruling executing Humphrey's executor, rather, if you look at the Cook ruling, it's not only absurd that the court has basically carved out that the Federal Reserve is somehow special because it's so economically influential and it has this heritage in the first and second national banks, according to the ruling. But essentially, they read into the law something that is not there, which is to say that Federal Reserve governors can be fired for cause. And then the court also says that they are to be, they're allowed to have notice and hearing. But there's no notice and hearing language in the relevant statute when it comes to the hiring and firing of these governors. So they make it up out of thin air, essentially, that somehow Lisa Cook is subject to, she has these due process rights in her position on the Federal Reserve. And so consequently, the president saying that it looks like she committed mortgage fraud and that there's an obvious nexus between you can't have someone sitting on one of the most financially influential boards in the world and then also at the same time committing mortgage fraud or potentially committing mortgage fraud, that the president has to give her notice and hearing, that she has these due process rights. It's not there in the law. The other aspect, and this is more technical, that Justice Thomas points to in a tour de force of a dissent, is that the court has never said that the judiciary branch can uphold an injunction keeping someone in their job, essentially. It's never been done before in history, according to Justice Thomas. So he goes into all the other reasons, by the way, that the Federal Reserve Board has to be treated just like all of these other independent agencies. He talks about the fact that the majority loves how since the creation of the Federal Reserve, it supposedly helps stop all of these economic calamities, these benighted experts who know just how perfectly to calibrate interest rates and the money supply, et cetera. So I would call it a based dissent from Thomas, obviously challenging the establishment on the Fed. But at the end of the day, his bottom line, I think, is that the Federal Reserve is not different and distinct from all of these other independent agencies. Their officers have to be responsive to we the people ultimately as well. There's not some carve out for economics. And so the court at the end of the day says, well, they can undo an entire tariff regime and with all the chaos and the calamity that might create. But the simple act of allowing the president to remove one officer for a cause as he sees fit in a way that the court disagrees with, well, that's too much. That threatens the global financial system, and he can't do it. And I think that's an absurd proposition. So it's inconsistent with Slaughter, and it's also inconsistent ultimately with our constitutional order. We'll see if this ultimately gets remedied as the Cook case proceeds now through the lower courts.
All right. And with that, I'll send it right back to Ben to talk about the not good case today, the really not good case, which was the Election Day case.
Right. So I'm going to be the bear on the Supreme Court today, and my ire is only going to grow, I think, after we get the birthright citizenship case, and we'll all stew over that probably over the July 4th holiday. But in this case, what was at issue was a Mississippi law which says that mail-in ballots, so long as they're postmarked by Election Day, can be counted if they're received up to 5 days after Election Day. And Justice Barrett, writing for what I believe was a 5-4, effectively 5-4 majority for the court, said that in fact, Mississippi's reading of what Election Day constitutes passes muster. And essentially that the federal government, what matters, and when you look at the federal Election Day statutes, is that the vote is cast by Election Day, but receipt is entirely up to the states. So bifurcating essentially what constitutes an election and Election Day. And Justice Alito and others dissented from this opinion and essentially said Election Day means what it says. Election Day means Election Day. You can't torture and twist the language. It creates all sorts of practical problems, including potentially the incentive to ballot stuff if it looks like there's a very close election on Election Day, all manner of other practical issues associated with receipt of ballots. So how far after an election can a state accept the receipt of ballots? Can it be 30 days after, 50 days after, et cetera? All of these practical problems, in addition to undermining the appearance, if not the actual integrity of elections, as a consequence of what might happen if you have this totally lax and liberal mail-in balloting system, which is obviously grown in states across the country. And then beyond that, he says that this reading of what Election Day means in federal law is inconsistent with the law, the statutes, the practice over time. And so I think those positions are not bridgeable at the end of the day between the majority and the dissenters here. And even if you set aside all of the practical concerns and the election integrity concerns around this process, and you say, well, those are political and those are for the legislative branch to deal with and for the states to deal with, which is Justice Barrett's argument writing for the majority. Does Election Day mean Election Day or not? And I think this decision really stands in contrast, for example, to the decisions that we saw last week on immigration, where the court essentially said, the law says what the law says, that temporary protections, the TPS system, actually means temporary, and it can be revoked, TPS status for a country, just like it can be issued. Or same thing for arriving at a port of entry means arriving at a port of entry. It doesn't mean being in another country and saying you want to arrive at a port of entry. So where the court reads the language as it should be read when it wants to read it one way, it takes another reading of the language when it wants to come to another outcome, in my view. And I'll also point out again, if we imagine a so-called 6-3 left-wing majority in the Supreme Court, there's no way that they would arrive at the sorts of outcomes that the purported conservative 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court comes out to. So that's my bearish take on this. We'll see if is mail-in balloting and the receipt of ballots going to prove distinct from where the court comes down on a whole slew of other election and voting related issues. We'll have to see, but this certainly flows naturally, I think, from where we saw the court come down, for example, in the 2020 election, where you had state authorities changing rules and regulations around elections, and it wasn't the legislative branch within the states doing it, it was the executives, and the court wouldn't touch those issues. This certainly seems to flow naturally from where the court has come down on other election and voting related issues, and so I think it's a major red flag. But I put it to you, what do you make of this ruling? Do you think it's not as bad as I make it out to be, and state legislators are still going to have the freedom to ensure that there is some appearance, at least, of integrity? Or is the lack of integrity or appearance in some states enough to poison the well for the entire system effectively, which I've argued before.
I think the point of mail-in voting is fraud. It's a feature, not a bug. I'm the son of a career Army officer. When I was growing up, we spent 7 years living overseas, and my parents voted absentee. It's the one example where I think the people who have written our election day laws understood that there is a proper exemption from otherwise good laws and norms and procedures around this, because you're serving your country overseas as you've been asked to do, as you've been ordered to do. If you're a diplomat, if you're an Army soldier, an officer, fine. And also, those tend not to make a meaningful difference in the outcome of elections, right? So both you're doing something that you've been asked to do, we can create a small exception for that. It's probably not going to, at the end of the day, determine the outcome. Why in the world do you need this if you're a citizen of Mississippi or California? Why in the world can you not get off your duff and go vote in person, especially given that we've also extended the length of time during which you can vote in person to include, in some cases, days and even weeks prior to an election? The only reason you would do it is to facilitate fraud. And it's just ridiculous that these supposed Supreme Court justices with conservative bona fides would go out of their way to interpret the law to perpetuate an unnecessary and unjust system.
Yeah, I mean, my view of this case comes down to textualism. I take a pretty broad view of the state powers here to conduct their elections as they see fit. I think they do have that constitutional power, but at the end of the day, the reading of federal law in this case stretches the imagination. And I think Ben was right to make the comparison between arrive in the United States, a plain common sense phrase, and election day, another plain common sense phrase with a specific meaning. Um, I mean, and on the subject itself, on the from the policy perspective, right? There are a lot of things that to bolster Eric's point here, there are a lot of things that states could do if they wanted to have mail-in balloting, to make it a lot more secure. And almost none of those states do any of those things. They could clean the voter rolls pretty aggressively. They could require, ID when you sign up. They could cross-check different registration lists and voting lists. There's a lot of things that they could do to make, or for example, forbidding it, which what's legal in California, which is wild, right? Ballot harvesting, where you just have union workers going around to entire apartment buildings worth of voters, registering them and then having them make their X or their smiley face on Skid Row. All of those things are, to my mind, just open invitations of fraud, even if one wants to have the possibility to vote for mail, vote by mail. And most of the states that allow mass mail-in voting do not do any of those other auxiliary things to try to create a system that voters can have confidence in. And there isn't a lot that's more dangerous, honestly, than the declining institutional faith in our elections. Once we lose that, we really are in Civil War territory, because when people don't feel that they can even count on their vote to matter at all, we're in banana republic territory, and it's not good. So this should be a simple case. Election day means election day.
Yeah, I admit to being very surprised by this outcome. I thought we were going to get an easy win here on election day, meaning election day. But thank you, Roberts and Barrett, for deciding that, the current mess of elections where people are counting votes for weeks afterwards is not constitutionally prohibited by a law not statutorily prohibited by a law that says election shall happen on an election day. That is, it's a terrible decision. I think, I've talked before about what the proper response should be. I still think the proper response, especially to these ridiculous California elections, is the House of Representatives just taking it on its own accord and saying, we're the place where you really want, we have these contested elections in states that are fully Democrat controlled. So we have the right to be the judge of whether you won them or not. And if an election result comes in the way Nithya Raman's came in, like just, the third place candidate somehow massively gaining all these votes that she needs when the first place Democratic candidate doesn't budge. Also, we're just going to look at an election like that and be like, well, we don't think you actually won it, and you're going to need to prove that you won it. You're going to need to prove the absence of fraud. There are other remedies that we need to pursue. I don't know that the SAVE Act is going to happen, but there's certainly stuff we need to pursue. All right, next is Eric and his discussion of Texas's changes to the curriculum.
Yeah, thanks, Will. This was a story that popped this week. And if you heard, speaking of popping, if you heard popping sounds, it wasn't the 4th of July fireworks coming early. It was just liberal heads exploding throughout the news media as they learned that the state of Texas added, wait for it, the Bible to their public school curriculum materials. This is a program that has existed, that's now existing in a kind of an expanded form. And the creators of this curriculum, K-8, bolstered the number of references to things like Jesus, the Psalms, biblical stories, all throughout the curriculum. So in an art curriculum, for example, they're going to talk about the Last Supper, and they're going to reference, the Last Supper as you discuss this matter. In a segment on kings and queens, in addition to talking about Cinderella and Queen Victoria, they're going to talk about King Solomon as an example. And of course, this cannot be allowed to stand in the eyes of NPR, CNN, various pseudo-government NGOs, no doubt funded with your tax money, whose heads are just exploding over this. But I thought I'd take just a few minutes to read for you from the New York Times breathless coverage of this, because I think you can literally hear the ironic, righteous indignation in this article, which includes bold font. I don't know that the New York Times often has news reporting that puts phrases in bold letters, but maybe we can drop a link to this in the show notes so people can see it for themselves. Here's an example. History lessons weave in stories about Jesus. It says a typical elementary school lesson on ancient Roman civilization, for example, might describe how Christianity influenced the Roman Empire. The old Amplify curriculum spends about 4 paragraphs on Jesus's parables, his crucifixion, and the Christian belief in his resurrection. In the original grade unit, Jesus is mentioned 19 times. In the new unit, Jesus is mentioned 87 times in big, bold letters, just to emphasize the point. It goes on to talk about Bible stories, things like discussing stories of the prodigal son alongside the boy who cried wolf. In the old section on kings and queens, there was no reference to the Bible, but now there's an 18-page lesson on King Solomon, who is widely regarded as the wisest person who ever lived. At least it used to be widely regarded that way when people were familiar with the Bible. And this is ultimately the point, right? We're not actually talking about religious indoctrination in public schools. The way they have grounded this, and I think the way we can quite easily embrace it as a good, is that the Bible is simply the most important, most influential work that has ever been published in any language or people group. It has spawned numerous religions. It is the holy book of Jews, of Catholics, of Protestants, of Mormons, and of other religious groups who all look at it with some form of reference, including in Islam, where they would look at it and see Jesus as a significant prophet. You simply cannot be a learned person when it comes to art or literature or cultural references of any kind without understanding things like the story of David and Goliath, or Esther, or to wander into the Sistine Chapel and look around and think, oh, who's that naked guy, and why is he trying to touch that other naked guy? It's ludicrous that these heads would explode over something that is so fundamentally basic. Now, of course, we can also affirm that this is more than appropriate for the United States of America, because our nation was founded on this book and the principles contained herein. We can have a substantive debate about the role of religious freedom in America, about the place for other religious traditions within our system. I think that's good and healthy. There are wide parameters for people to practice their own religious beliefs and faith that should be safeguarded. But the simple fact is, you can't understand this country on its 250th birthday and the people who dwell within it without being familiar with the Bible. And thank God for Texas for understanding that truth, putting it into their curriculum, and preparing their citizens to be productive contributors to society. I think more states should follow their lead in doing this moving forward.
Yeah, this really reminds me of a deep cut. In 2010, Texas revised its social studies standards. I wanted to say history standards is what it should be called, but Texas revised its social studies standards. And there was a similar New York Times article just freaking out about it. For example, the fact that Thomas Jefferson, who the left liked back in 2010 because he was supposedly the deist, the anti-religious bigot of the founders. Now he's the slaver who had a relationship with his slave. Also not true necessarily. Anyway, but they took him from the Great Thinkers of America section and put him in the Founders section, except that the New York Times didn't read the Founders section and just wrote an entire column about how Thomas Jefferson had been eliminated from the Texas social studies standards, right? So this kind of hysteria is not new. Eric is completely correct. You can't understand Western civilization without a basic knowledge of the Bible. Just to pull a few episodes from American history, fourscore and 7 years ago is a reference to the biblical lifespan, right? It going more with Lincoln, I guess I'm sure if I had more time, I could think of a lot more of these, but in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, if you're a student learning about the Civil War, when Lincoln says a house divided against itself cannot stand, where does that come from? It's a reference from the Bible. You actually can't understand the debates of America well into the 20th century and for sure in the 18th and 19th century. You cannot read an original document without understanding references to the King James Bible. So this is an entirely appropriate secular subject for students. That does not have to be the actual teaching of religion. This is something that every educated person should know. And regularly we see that the quote unquote educated, although I should call them credentialed, left liberals of the New York Times and NPR regularly embarrass themselves on this subject by misunderstanding basic religious terms. Just in the last few years, I remember the New York Times not understanding the phrase body of Christ and taking it literally. The NPR, once when I was listening, they actually gave Ted Cruz the credit for the very radical idea that rights come from God and not from government, another essential biblical principle derived by the founders, right? They actually thought that was a crazy new invention of Senator Ted Cruz. I'm sure he'd like to take the credit, but I hate to say, right? So there is a widespread religious illiteracy among the supposedly educated classes of America, and that's because of decisions that this one reverses, right? The decision to remove basic Western canon education from our K-12 schools. There is nothing wrong. I'm not a Christian. There is nothing wrong with a familiarity with the Bible. In fact, I would not call you a good citizen or an educated person if you don't have a basic familiarity with the book that transformed and is the basis of Western civilization.
Yeah, I agree with all this. The one, I think Yoram and Josh Hammer had a good article about trying to reverse. I forget what the decision was, but just the whole way that Establishment Clause jurisprudence has worked and kind of trying to keep quote unquote religion out of public schools has led to the sneaking in of religion and by another name into public schools, which is just wokeism. Like, as long as you're not teaching about the existence of a deity, you're allowed to sneak in whatever crazy crap you want. And because it's not even competing with the religious teaching, you get woke progressivism as the default mode. I also, kind of look back, like, I'm not a religious person, but I kind of regret the lack of exposure to the Bible I would have gotten at a younger age as a result of being in a public school that would teach the thing that is sort of the basis of our civilization and the key to understanding analogies and allegories throughout our literature, throughout everything else, throughout our art. So I think this is just a good thing. We should teach more of the Bible. It's the underpinning of our civilization, and certainly what's not the underpinning of our civilization is an ethical code devised by Judith Butler in the 1950s. So I think this is a big, substantial improvement over that.
So once again, I agree with everyone's remarks here on the merits. Intellectually, morally, spiritually, you have to engage with these texts. And then even just to be a good citizen and a good American, you have to understand the underpinnings of our entire system of liberty, of justice, of the values and principles that are baked into the structure, the letter, and the spirit of our country as well. These are essential texts. And it starts, of course, with the Bible. And I think the reason the left really hates this, to Will's point, is that they believe that schools need to be indoctrination centers for left-wing ideology to incubate the next generation of activists who want to tear down and destroy the system. And so there cannot be any competition for the state anti-religion of progressivism in the classroom. Competing ideas are a massive threat to the entire business and political model they've put forth. And so, God forbid, students get exposed to ideas, stories, values, principles that completely challenge the indoctrination they're getting every other second of every day that they're in these institutions. Last but not a couple more things. One, this might inspire other states, so that's a big positive as well, potentially. But another is just the irony here when it comes to the New York Times. The quote from Dean Baquet at the New York Times was, "We don't get religion. We don't get the role of religion in people's lives, and I think we can do much, much better." That was what he wrote some years back about the fact that the New York Times is completely out to lunch when it comes to covering all things religion. So the fact that then the likes of the Times oppose actually teaching the Bible in school, well, that would have actually informed their writers, but they're against it, of course. And that's why they don't get religion. They don't want to, and they hate people who are actually religious as well.
All right, with that, we'll send it over to Inez to talk about the Iran deal, or the Iran, not the Iran deal, the Iran update.
The breaking of the deal. Yeah, just one more point on the previous subject. The Schempp decision that did exile a lot of these religious materials, or religious instruction, I should say, from our public schools was decided, of course, in the Supreme Court building, which has the engraven image of Moses as the lawgiver coming down with the Ten Commandments. So the whole thing is quite absurd. Yeah, so Iran update. This might be one of the more sort of vacillating and confusing end question mark to a war ever. But once again, we had an exchange of hostilities. We had U.S. bombings taking place of Iranian targets, vice versa, missiles headed towards U.S. bases and U.S. allies in the region. Fortunately, I don't think there were any casualties from those attacks. This seems to stem from a couple things. There's some speculation as to what it stems from, but one, there is clearly a disagreement, to frame it lightly, between the United States and Iran as to whether or not the MOU gives Iran control of the strait. That seems to be kind of the whole issue here. Iran believes that it has the right to stop traffic and to fire on traffic. All of these recent hostilities were kicked off by Iran firing on international traffic in the strait. So Iran clearly thinks that they have the right to govern the traffic in the strait, and under this MOU, the United States strongly disputes that. Again, I'm not really sure what this MOU is doing at this point, since it is not exactly, it's no longer a ceasefire. There's no ceasing of the fire in either direction here. Then, in addition to this, we have this side deal that apparently Secretary Rubio brokered between Israel, Lebanon, and the United States, dealing with Hezbollah. This is something, again, that, the Iranian delegation probably thinks, or is trying to argue, as part of the MOU. The United States would argue that is clearly not part of the MOU. President Trump sending his usual sort of bombastic social media posts saying that if Iran wants to continue violating this agreement, and violence with violence. It will be the vice president even saying it will be met with violence, and then the president saying the Republic of Iran will not exist anymore, meaning the regime will not exist anymore if it continues to flout the agreement, and the U.S. will go right back to bombing Iran the way that it was before. I don't know what you guys think about any of these developments. My thought, there's one interesting sort of speculation that I've seen going around, which is that we might really be seeing the total splintering of control within the regime of Iran, that this may reflect rather a disjoint between the people who are negotiating on behalf of the regime and their control over IRGC commanders. This has been raised before, the specter of essentially rogue parts of the military that the regime has returned against itself. That is a potential signal of immense weakness. On the other hand, as Ben is always quick to remind us, Iran, or what is it? Iran has never won a war and it's never lost a negotiation. They are very good at stalling. They're very good at lying in negotiations. They're very good at weaseling out of commitments that they make and then just ignoring those commitments that they make and in order to get more time to rebuild themselves. I frankly, I know I speak for a lot of Americans where I don't know anymore what's going on in this war. I don't really have a clear understanding. I hope that our representatives in the White House understand more about what's going on than I do from reading the news, because it seems like the news changes every 12 hours. And one thing that is quite certain is that there is not as I said, a lot of ceasing of the fire in this ceasefire under the MOU, and it seems like there will be continued kinetic action back and forth, even though there has been some kind of deal reached once again on this particular exchange of hostilities. It seems likely to me that we will repeat exchanges of hostilities in the future. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most interesting thing is what's going on in Lebanon, because you have, at the outset, you had the Iranians saying that we treat any failure to withdraw by the Israelis as a violation of the ceasefire. And I think I've talked about, like, one of the things I've found kind of obnoxious about the written MOU was that it purported to control the behavior of Israel without Israel having any say in the agreement whatsoever. And I thought that was a failure point. But it may be just kind of a way, it may have just been sort of a negotiating tactic where we say, no, we commit to a ceasefire, but we don't commit to, in our interpretation being, we don't commit to Israel, dismantling terror infrastructure in southern Lebanon, which is used to attack it. Like, we don't care about that. And it sort of puts the Iranians in a position where it's like, hey, actually, the way the Americans understand this deal is way worse than what we thought. So does that put them in a worse position? Does that help splinter their government? I don't know. But given the way that the US understands the deal, I think this is actually a point to say that, like, everybody who is panicking about it, this is not, we're sort of maybe we were being too literal in this context, because it looks like the Trump administration is not giving the Iranians any benefit of the doubt. They're not going back on any of their commitments to let Israel control its own borders and to allow it to just not, to allow it to deal with terrorism. And so the Iranians find it to be a much worse deal from that perspective, where they're basically only getting the ability to sell their own oil at a little bit of a better price. And maybe they'll get some frozen assets out of this in exchange for Hormuz, but they're not getting anything else. And they're not going to be able to save Hezbollah from what the Israelis are doing. So I think interestingly, like, this sort of recent spat has actually improved the way the MOU looks and should look from people who are, kind of supportive of the current relationship between the United States and Israel.
So on the Lebanon aspect of things, it's hard to know right now whether there's an actual difference between the MOU on the one hand and this agreement between Israel and Lebanon on the other, because they seem somewhat contradictory. To Will's point, first of all, Lebanon is explicitly referenced in the MOU, and this was perceived as a massive achievement for Iran, which is to say, being able to link Lebanon and Hezbollah to a broader deal between the US and Iran, first of all, validated the use of a proxy for the Iranians. Second of all, locked in potentially the protection of Hezbollah during the pendency of whatever agreement was going on. And then it also carved out essentially or hived out rather, Israel. And there were these reports that essentially the Lebanon portfolio item was going to be dealt with by Qatar, Pakistan, Iran, and Lebanon, and that Israel would have no say, despite the fact that Israel is operating there in southern Lebanon because Israel has had to depopulate northern Israel because of the Hezbollah existential threat right over its border. And essentially, as I understand it, this agreement between Israel and Lebanon, negotiated separately, locks in the presence of Israeli troops to clear out southern Lebanon, does not require any sort of massive withdrawal and demobilization, let alone prohibit Israel from continuing to pick off Hezbollah leaders and their assets as well. So that's significant because Iran really wants to again link Lebanon and Hezbollah to a broader agreement. It wants to protect Hezbollah, ensure that it survives, ensure that it serves as the cat's paw on Israel's border. And it also wants to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel over Lebanon more broadly. Obviously, if you can split the U.S. and Israel militarily and beyond, that's a huge gain for Iran and its proxies because it means there's a weaker counter force against them. So very significant potentially, the Lebanon-Israel agreement, even though I have massive doubts about Lebanon's ability to do anything to stop a Hezbollah that has taken over its country. It has repeatedly shown it's unwilling or unable to mobilize its military forces, that they have the capability, let alone the will, to police within their own borders and actually rid themselves of Hezbollah. And that's precisely why Israel has been operating there in the first place. But let's ultimately see what happens. Another significant development, I think, is the fact that there has been U.S. kinetic action in response to ceasefire violations by Iran. That's really important because the Iranian perception may be that the administration is pretty much willing to do anything and everything possible to buy quiet for as long as possible, at least through the midterm elections. And I talked about it on the last episode. If you're going to live by oil prices, you can also die by oil prices. And so there's no guarantee that Iran is going to play nice through the midterm elections. Why does it want to do any solids to this administration, to the Republicans more broadly? But the way to ensure that they only cheat to a certain extent and not fully on this deal and try to exploit it and take advantage of it is to show that you're willing and able to go about attacking them to the extent they step out of line. And so it is significant that we have engaged in some kinetic actions. Again, I'm dubious of being able to snap back sanctions, again, willingness or capability to do so after 60 days. And I'm also skeptical about whether or not we can really re-engage and mobilize and engage in massive kinetic actions down the road, in part practically, and then also because there may be a total lack of political will the longer that there is something of a thawing here. And I think that's ultimately may prove to our detriment to the extent you have Iran building up all of its assets again. But that's precisely why we struck now, because supposedly it has started repositioning and rebuilding its assets. So I think that's a good sign. The only way you can ever deal with this regime is showing a willingness to use massive and disproportionate aggression against them until and unless they change their ways. And as I've argued before, I'm very skeptical that they have changed their ways or they will change their ways.
Eric, did you chime in on this? I forget.
No, I didn't. I know we're up against the clock. I'll just say this is brilliant analysis from all of you. I found the vice president's interview with Ross Douthat last week to be good on this question. Despite his critics, I think the vice president has rightly attempted to walk a very fine line here between the uses of American power, as Benjamin just described, in pursuit of American interests. And finding the extent of that is an art more than a science. I'm sure all of you, am greatly relieved that to date, we have not escalated this conflict beyond what I think we would all agree are reasonable parameters, namely by invading or taking some other drastic measure, but continuing to apply pressure and continuing to show that we do have an interest in this region. It is very specific and known, and we're not going to be kowtowed is good. I commend the administration for continuing to do it, even as we creep closer to midterm elections. And I know they're feeling the pinch of increased gas prices and prices across the board largely are as a result of this. Iran knows that's their greatest leverage. But there is an American interest here, and they should continue to press and hopefully eventually soon arrive at a just outcome.
All right. Cool with that. I'll do final thoughts. I think, oh, right, my final thought. Sorry. The Europeans don't have air conditioning. This is sort of ridiculous. I'm seeing this all over. They've decided that, I saw some clip today where, they've just got this panel discussion in the UK, and one of these idiot grains is like, well, we have to consider the impacts on global warming if we use air conditioning. And it's like, you guys are killing your elders. I don't know why that's acceptable. You're murder, you are allowing the needless and avoidable deaths of, your sources of wisdom and people you should be preserving because you won't spend the money to give them air conditioning so they aren't baking in like 90-degree heat. And like 95-year-olds should not be in 90-degree heat. They should have air conditioning. People who are going through heart surgery should have air conditioning. Your country should have air conditioning. It's not proving anything other than you're just like bereft of care for those of you who aren't like young and healthy in order to prevent like global warming, which you aren't even preventing because China's emitting more than you would ever stop emitting because you're not having air conditioning. Like the Europeans are, I think we need to get to the point where we call the Europeans straight up like uncivilized and barbaric because they refuse to properly protect their elders from heat stroke for no reason other than vague notions about the environment.
Yeah, sadly, tragically, I think killing their elders is a feature, not a bug, for the Europeans and their social welfare state. In Canada, they had to pass euthanasia to be able to accomplish the same thing.
I was going to say, I saw a tweet circulating the other day that made me laugh. So the only acceptable reasons to kick off in Europe are by euthanasia, heat stroke, or by machete attack from a migrant. So my final thought is just to preview, since we probably won't get to the birthright citizenship case that will be handed down tomorrow until the flip side of the weekend. What I would look for in that decision, which is likely to go against the Trump administration, and I think was always likely to go against the Trump administration, is a non-constitutionalization of the issue. So we have that Wong Kim art case from the 19th century making constitutionalizing the question of green card holders, right? So if somebody is legally in the United States, has a child on U.S. soil, that child has birthright citizenship as part of the 14th Amendment. That case is unlikely to be overturned. I'll put it that way. I also happen to think it's correctly decided. But what I would look for here is a non-extension of, basically, we've assumed that the 14th Amendment in that case also covers the children of people who are here illegally. Now, the Trump administration has argued that they're not subject to the jurisdiction. We went through the arguments at the time. I don't think those arguments are likely to pass muster, but I would look for the court not, at least, to extend and actually make a ruling on the point of the children of illegals and whether or not they're subject to the jurisdiction. That would already be the better outcome for the right in this case. They can decide this case on all kinds of grounds. They can say that the Trump administration doesn't have the power to rewrite because Congress has also spoken on this issue. There was legislation passed back in the 1950s on this issue. They can just defer to federal law. They can say Congress can change the law, but the president can't unilaterally change something like this by EO. That would be, I think, a victory for the right. What would be really bad in this issue would be an explicit opinion that memorializes what is now dicta and a footnote in Pyler v. Doe that says that, yes, the 14th Amendment requires that the children of illegals be granted birthright citizenship. That's what I would call like the big L for the right. Whereas taking the small L that perhaps the administration is beyond its skis on this argument and that Congress has to speak on this question, I think that would actually constitute at least a half victory for the right. So that's what I am looking for, is leaving the door open for Congress or for potential other kinds of regulatory moves around the edges. That this is not a constitutional question. This is something that the citizens of the United States should be able to decide through normal channels. This is not required by the 14th Amendment.
250 years in, it's a sad commentary, in my view, that we're talking about what's the least bad Supreme Court decision going to be on a practice in birthright citizenship that's totally unmoored from the 14th Amendment and relevant statutes and mere sanity within a republic where, amazingly, even the European countries and other countries are more sane in terms of their own anti-birthright citizenship policies. So what I would say is we have the greatest system that was ever created, but we have human beings that are operating it. And like every single nation that has ever come before us, the things that make us great, we ultimately fatten up as a consequence of them, and we lose the will and the capability to do what's necessary to defend them. And so you end up with the likes of the democratic socialists, so-called, getting elected in all of our biggest cities, which I think augurs very poorly. The question will be ultimately, do we still have the antibodies to fight against the enemies of our civilization? And does the imperiling of the system ultimately cause us to rise up and have a refounding and persist for at least another 250 years? And I think that is the maybe sobering, but I think critical question to consider at 250. Now, I'll also say that every generation probably thinks that the generation before them was better and that things have declined. And yet here we still are as a beacon to all the other nations of the world. So we'll see how it plays out. And we're not passive actors in this. We're all contributors to it. And so hopefully we can all fight for a 250 that ultimately, a next 250 that eclipses the first incredible 250 that we're celebrating this upcoming July 4th.
All right, with that, yeah, good final note that yes, happy 4th to everybody. We'll see you next week after this, but thank you for watching. And on behalf of Inez, Ben, and Eric, I'm Will Chamberlain. We will see you at the next NatCon Squad.